Hey, hey, hey. How are we doing? I am very warm. Hope everyone else is having a nice time in the sun. This always feels weird, this bit, because I know no one's there, and you know no one's there. But, oh, someone's here. Meg-John Barker's here. Hello. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome. Right, I'm going to add you to the video. We've got lots of people joining. Welcome, welcome.
Oh my god, this works! Hello!
Hello!
Hiya.
Welcome!
Good to be here. Gosh, it's the first time I've done an Instagram one, so this is new on me, but this is working.
Yeah. You've nailed it already. Perfect.
Well, it's quite hard to get the phone in just the right place, but I think we're good.
It is. My tripod is broken, so it's like stacked up by books, so it's going to fall at any minute.
Yeah, same. Okay, great. That's good. We're all on the same page then.
Everyone's going to be kept on their toes today, I think.
Yes. Oh, we're getting love hearts already. We've not even done anything yet.
No, good thing. We'll just sit silently and get love hearts. Well, Meg-John, thank you so much for joining us. We are so thrilled to have you. I'm so excited. And I feel a bit creepy as well because I listen to your podcast and I love your podcast. And I've been listening to it especially this week because I was going to speak to you. So I feel like I've been speaking to you all week in this
that must be so weird. Yeah.
quite creepy way.
You are an ear pal.
Yeah, love that. So yes, thank you so much for joining us. So just thank you everyone who is watching. Thank you so much for tuning in. Just let you know, I am Evie. I am the resident sex clown of Shush. I do
That's an excellent description.
Good, I'm glad you like it. I basically make an idiot of myself whilst talking about sex, which is one of life's greatest joys. And then here we have the incredible Meg-John Barker, and I'm going to try and introduce you, but I'm sure I'm not going to do it justice, so please add in at the end.
Also a sex clown, I think, by that definition, you know.
Yeah, done. So Meg-John Barker is an author of a number of very, very popular books on gender and sex and sexuality and relationships. I'm going to name some of these books. I'm sure I'll miss some out as well, but Queer, A Graphic History, Gender, A Graphic Guide, How to Understand Your Gender, Life Isn't Binary, Enjoy Sex, How, When and If You Want to, Rewriting the Rules, The Psychology of Sex and the Secrets of Enduring Love. They have also written lots of books for scholars and counsellors on these topics, and also have an incredible podcast called Meg-John and Justin, which is so worth listening to. And if you are someone who is interested in sex and interested in having your mind transformed about how we can view sex and relationships, they are definitely someone to delve into. Have I missed anything out? Do you want to add anything in?
No, that sounds good. Yeah, like megjohnandjustin.com is our podcast website if you want to check that out. And also I write on my own blog, rewritingtherules.com as well. So that's a lot more mental health focused, but also sex, gender and relationships. And actually I got your questions this afternoon in advance, thankfully. And so I've done a little blog post answering the questions. So if there's anything we don't get to today, I'll put it up on my blog.
Oh, amazing.
Well. Yeah.
Oh, doing homework already.
Right? I'm prepared.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And firstly, you do so many things. And on your podcast and your blog, you go into so many different topics. How do you find the time to do it all? You're just everywhere.
Yeah, I think there was a problem for a while. I was doing too many things. So I have recently gone self-employed as an author, and it was amazing because I was an academic, I was also a therapist, so and an activist. I was just doing far too much. So it's really nice now that I'm focused just on the writing and the podcast. So really, I just do the creative stuff. I don't try and talk to academics really anymore. I'm not doing therapy myself. I'm just focused on writing for a general audience about these topics, which is what my passion is like how to get these ideas from like psychotherapy world, from the academic world, from the activist world, and synthesize them together and like get them out to everyday folks like in a way that they can understand, rather than often the language is really hard to understand from all of those quarters.
Of course, making it accessible.
Right.
Brilliant mission. And how has lockdown been for you in general? How have you been doing?
Well, it's been pretty good actually. I had some quite serious post-traumatic stress because I had a really stressful year last year. So lockdown for me could not have come at a better time. It was like everything got cancelled. I was like, I can focus on looking after myself. So yeah, like, well, it's been a tough ride. It's been, yeah, really great to just have the time to sink into like healing and doing a lot of reading, like being able to read about bits I didn't understand before around more trauma-informed perspectives and some of the social justice bits that I hadn't been so familiar with. So I feel like I've been doing an interesting course, like inside and out.
Oh wow, that's brilliant. Some much needed space there.
Yeah, definitely.
Wonderful. Can I ask you some questions?
Please do, far away. Yes.
So you have written lots of books on non-binary and trans issues, being Gender, a graphic guide, as I mentioned before, and Life Isn't Binary and How to Understand Your Gender. Could you give us an idea about how you got into writing about sex and relationships and gender, and especially this sort of talking about gender and LGBTQIA issues?
Yeah, well, the answer might be surprising to people, I guess, who only know me recently, because you might think, oh, it's because I've been like queer all my life and like, you know, I talk about all the queer things. But actually, I had a very normative idea about gender and sex and relationships when I was a kid. I really got the message that, you know, romantic relationships were the passport to happiness. And in order to have them, you had to be very normative. I was assigned female at birth. So like trying to be very normative feminine and to have certain kinds of sex, which generally weren't the ones that I was very interested in. And that all led to a lot of pain for me personally, like trying to conform to that stuff. And I don't think that's necessarily because I was different. I think it doesn't work very well for anybody. So a lot of my writing comes from that place, like these cultural norms around how to do relationships and sex and gender, they're not serving anyone. They're really not, you know, like the gender ones, for example, you know, we know about men's mental health issues that relate to like not being able to show emotion or ask for support. And we know about, you know, a lot of women's mental health issues relate to having to be for others and to sort of have all your value in being attractive and desirable, you know, so it's not serving anybody. So my take on this is always that it's not so much coming from that like minority perspective of like how can we make things better for a marginalized minority, although I'm also very passionate about that, obviously. It's also about how is this bad for everybody, and how could we really like have systemic and structural change and cultural change rather than just this level of the individual navigating this stuff.
Oh, interesting. So it came from your personal experiences, and then you studied psychology, didn't you? Is that you were a doctor of psychology?
Right? I kind of wish I hadn't studied psychology, actually.
Oh, really? Why?
Yeah, everyone does it because they think, oh, I'm going to understand what makes me tick and other people tick, and then it's like, oh, it's all about like the brain and cognition and like statistics. There's a whole lot of statistics. So if I could go back, I would have probably studied sociology, philosophy, and psychotherapy, because I've studied all those areas since then. I feel like they've got a lot more to say about the human condition than psychology. But I did learn some useful stuff from psychology as well. So again, I try and weave it all together in my work. Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I would have thought that was exactly what psychology was.
Yeah, no, if you want to understand human beings, like, take a psychotherapy course, maybe do some philosophy, sociology perhaps. I wouldn't go near psychology, to be honest.
And do you, so you sort of described your journey into it, is sort of teaching about this and making it more accessible for other people, was that sort of your journey of reclaiming that for yourself, because you're talking about growing up in a very heteronormative, was that part of it, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I just got lucky as well. I started working at this place teaching psychology, and you know, again, I hadn't even engaged with feminism at that point. It's my early 20s, and they got me teaching the gender course because it was being taught by a cis guy, and he just didn't want to be teaching the gender course on his own. Like, that wasn't great look. So they had me teach. I knew nothing about this, and suddenly I've got like feminism 101. Suddenly I'm thinking about sexuality, and then I got involved in activism. Like, I found bisexual activism, polyamory, kink, all at the same time. Like, jumped in head first, made loads of mistakes, but like that was like my personal journey, and it just seemed obvious to me that you get politically active on these things, and that led me to like much more intersectional ideas and realizing that all of the kind of intersecting identities and experiences need to, you know, there's all these different axes of oppression that we need to be looking at simultaneously. So sex, gender, and relationships isn't the whole of it, but that was kind of where I started.
Oh, how interesting.
Right?
What journey.
Yeah, it's been a long journey.
Yeah, and I've been chatting to lots of sex educators on these, and just sort of like being a sex educator at Shush, I'm always so interested of how people got into this wonderful world, and
lots of
how
terrible
often...
sex is the answer for me. Like lots of years of really awful.
Oh, that's so true.
We just want to make it better for other people. It doesn't have to be so bad. It can be
better. Yeah, absolutely. Maybe that I feel like lots of people assume that it's the sex educators that are having the best sex, but I mean, maybe
now, obviously now, yes, not initially.
Yeah. Amazing. We have a few questions to sort of start off about kind of more trans issues, and maybe sort of very much about being a good ally, really, and sort of ways as cisgender people, if you're a cis person watching, how we can be the best allies, particularly at this time where it feels incredibly important, because
it's utterly horrendous to be trans right now. Yes. There's no question about that.
So let's start really simple. What does it mean to be a transgender person? What does that mean today, right now?
So, like, my definition would be anybody whose experience of their gender does not match the one that was assumed at birth. So if you imagine the doctor getting the scan and going, it's a boy, it's a girl, like anyone whose experience now doesn't match that in any way. I guess that would be my broad definition. And some people assume like trans has to be people who've changed name or pronoun, or who've gone on hormones or had surgery. So that's not necessarily the case. You know, some trans people do those things, but you're trans if you've changed in any way from the gender that was assumed when you were born. Yeah,
very clear. Thank you. And so you would could you explain a little bit about the language around sort of gender non-conforming people, gender queer people, non-binary people, for someone who doesn't know, isn't familiar with that kind of language? How would you describe those terms?
I think all of those broadly mean people. So trans is the big umbrella, and so that'd be anyone who, you know, doesn't match the gender that was assumed at birth. And under that, there's trans men and there's trans women, which people probably are more familiar with. But there's also non-binary people, or sometimes called gender queer or gender non-conforming, and that would be anyone who, broadly speaking, their experience of their gender is something other than man or woman. So outside the gender binary. So our culture is really gender binary. It assumes people are either men or women. You know, kids our kids are assumed to be a boy or a girl. And anyone who's like between or some amount of both or beyond, like that would be a non-binary person. Non-binary person is probably the commonest umbrella term, but gender queer and gender non-conforming get used for kind of a similar thing. And I guess just the thing to remind people of at this point, if you're not, or to let you know if you don't already know, is that a lot of cultures around the world and a lot of cultures over time have not been binary when it comes to gender. There's been like 3 genders, 5 genders, or gender hasn't mattered that much about a person, or it didn't make sense to separate their gender from their sexuality and their spirituality or something like that. So it's like, this is quite a white Western way of understanding gender, is this binary model. But we're stuck with it at the moment, and it's pretty awful. As I've said, it's pretty awful for the people who fit in it and the people who don't fit in it. But that's what those terms generally mean.
Yeah. Oh, so interesting. And I was having a chat with Gayatri Kamalakandan on this live stream from Decolonizing Contraception.
Yeah.
And they were telling me all about Hinduism and the links of Hindu, and basically about sort of exactly what you were saying.
Yeah.
These gender norms and coming in through imperialism and through colonialism.
Precisely. And, you know, especially in kind of in terms of Native American culture, you know, a genocide of, you know, genocide in general with that settler colonialism, but a lot of people who were particularly killed were what is now called Two-Spirit people, so people whose genders didn't match the binary. So yeah, a lot of the colonialist project involved like imposing a gender binary on places that weren't already gender binary. So this is why we can't really disentangle gender and sex and relationships also from capitalism, also from colonialism, from white supremacy, from ableism. You know, it's like we have to look at it all together.
Yeah, this is why it has to be intersectional.
Yeah, totally.
And how for a cis person who is how do you ask someone's pronouns? What is the best way to do that? The most polite way to ask someone's pronouns?
Yeah, I guess with that one, it's good to model it. Like this idea that everyone has their pronouns, like on their Twitter handle and on their and the end of their email, or like if you're introducing yourself to someone, it's like my name is this and my pronouns are this, which I guess neither of us did at the beginning of this, but I'm MJ and my pronouns are they and them. Yeah, but you know, to say something like that and then say, you know, so how would you like me to refer to you? And probably only if it's relevant. Like if you're just meeting someone and you're never going to talk about them, you know, like then it's not necessary like to over egg it. It's always a bit of a nuanced one because like, you know, people do these pronoun circles sometimes at the start of events. And if you're the only person there who isn't using he or she pronouns, that can be quite exposing to do one of those. So it's sort of, again, there's a bit of nuance to all this. There's a bit of reading the room and deciding, you know, when it's a good idea. But we just shouldn't assume by looking at somebody that we know if they're cis or trans or that we know what pronoun they're likely to use. So general best practice is we just would all be doing that all the time, just always you know, having our pronouns as part of the introduction as much as our names.
Yeah, we should have done that. I'm so sorry. I am Evie Fehilly.
Great.
We'll edit it in the beginning.
Oh yeah, bang it at the beginning. No, I'll forget it myself. You know, again, it's like this is such an important area to just be like we're all on learning this. You know, we're all at that point of like this is quite new territory. Non-binary. It's really only been a culturally understood thing for maybe a decade. You know, like a lot of my life I didn't know it was an option. Like this is why, you know, I didn't come out as non-binary as a kid because you just, you know, what wasn't a thing. So yeah, I think there's got to be a lot of kindness for people playing catch up on this, and you know that non-binary people ourselves will constantly mess up. It's just we're often a bit more relaxed about when we mess up because, you know, kind of we get it. Whereas I think people who aren't non-binary can be pretty worried about this stuff.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I have lots of my sort of friends I grew up with are now primary school teachers, and my friend was telling me that she has I think a 8-year-old in her class who's describing themselves as non-binary, and all of the kids, like no trouble at all of the kids are being so accepting about it, and it really warmed my heart that there was
awesome. It's changing
that next
really
generation.
Fast. Yeah, it's changing really fast. Like you look at the stats on how many people in that generation are identifying as something other than male and female, and it's just like it has really gone up, and that's because it's been culturally available to people, and you know the gender binary has been so imposed, right? That it just doesn't fit. One study found that if you ask people about their experience rather than identity, about a third of people say that they feel that they are to some extent the other gender or neither gender or both genders. A third, like over a third of people have that experience. So, you know, although there's still quite a small number of people who say identify as non-binary, a whole lot of people don't experience themselves really within the gender binary very comfortably.
And what would that mean to be like to your experience rather than your identity? That means sort of like how you have felt positioned in the world, or like
like that's how they ask the question. You know, it's like, do you to some extent experience yourself as the other gender or both genders or neither gender? I guess it was still a bit of a binary question, but yeah, you know, and that's what I get when I do training on this. It's like at the beginning, I think good to say how many people would say they were non-binary in the room, and then we kind of unpack, you know, what's meant by kind of a masculine man and a feminine woman. You know, what does it mean to be a real man or a real woman? And like, and everyone's like, well, I don't fit either of those. Like, I definitely fit on the other side with a whole lot of things, you know, and I can certainly most people I know do. So, you know, it's what we almost like what we mean, and I think that's sort of similar with the trans cis binary as well. This is quite a kind of I'm trying to think of a polite word for headfuck, but I'm just going to say headfuck. But you know, like once you've questioned the man-woman binary, you can also question the trans cis binary. Like how many cis people really remain in gender that they were assumed to be at birth? You know, like gender's really fluid. We change in how we express and experience our gender over our lifetime. Actually, a lot of cis people have hormones at some point. A lot of cis people have surgeries even relating to their gender. So all these things we think of as trans things, they're not. A lot of cis people do them as well. So it's like we can question that binary. And then you're like, well, what about the binary, non-binary binary?
What about it?
Maybe we need to question that too.
Oh wow, amazing. Yeah, I mean, we just
like who's binary and who's not binary, and does that even, you know?
And is binary to binary? Oh wow,
Right.
This is really... We have had a really lovely comment that was, I can't even begin to tell you how much I needed this right now. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear it.
Thank you. So how, if you are, again, sort of being as an ally, and then we're going to move on to some other stuff, if you're an ally and you witness someone being misgendered, what is the best way to deal with that situation?
Yeah, so I guess what you're saying, somebody uses the wrong pronoun for somebody, something like that. Like, I think, just again, to really simply and straightforwardly correct, oh, I think Nancy uses they pronouns, or actually, Nancy uses he pronouns or whatever, and then, just move on. That's what people generally say, is like, it's like, apologize and move on if you're the one who's made the error, or just point it out and move on. If you want correcting, but trying not to shame people. Like, I'm reading a lot about shame at the moment, and I just really feel like shaming is such an unhelpful tactic in these areas, because what people just really either go into like defensive mode if they're shamed, or they really go into just like claps into it, and that's where you get people going, oh god, I'm so sorry, and then you get an email the next day, oh, I realized I did that thing, I'm so sorry, and then next week another night, oh, was my apology too much? You're not meant to apologize that much, are you? I'm so sorry for that too. It's like we're all in different places on all these axes of oppression, so we all have the ones that we feel like awful shame and like, oh god, I'm going to get it wrong around. And I feel like if we can manage not to further shame people, I guess if somebody is getting defensive and even abusive responses around their gender, then it's great if they can get somebody who's in that kind of ally position to do that emotional labour for them, of challenging that person, rather than them having to do it. That's the other thing I would say. It's not great if you have to do it yourself.
So important as allies to step up in that moment, but doing it in a very polite,
if you can, exactly.
way.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. And we sort of kind of touched on this already, but why does society give people who are gender non-conforming in some way such a hard time? Like, why does it seem to get people's heckles up so much in some parts of society? What are your thoughts on this? This is maybe too big a question.
No, it's a great question. I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about this. I mean, I think that there probably are a real spectrum of answers, and it kind of depends on the versions of transphobia, or this kind of backlash to the really rigid gender binary that we see. Piers Morgan's reasons are different from Germaine Greer's reasons, I suppose. But I think a big one for me, and it just relates to a lot more widely about the conversations we're seeing, like after Me Too and Black Lives Matter, and with this trans moral panic. It's like we're being shown on so many fronts at the moment just how oppressive our systems and structures have been, historically, for such a long time. And it's just really, really hard for people to hear that, I think. And so what you tend to see is this kind of backlash to, no, this is how it's always been and it's okay. And what you also see is this kind of minimizing, denial, victim blame, and defensiveness. Like, those four come up again and again in response to all these areas, right? It's like, no, it's not that bad to be in the oppressed group, or you're making it up that it even is an oppressed group, or you don't even exist. Like this, this whole non-binary thing is just made up, or certainly you've brought it on yourself. Any problems that you are experiencing. And you just see it across, just look at those conversations across, survivors, across Black Lives Matter conversations that are happening, and across trans, and you see really similar ways of denying and defending in play. So I think, people just really, really struggle to have this, these forms of systemic and structural oppression revealed. And that kind of defensiveness comes in there.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I guess I thought about particularly much like why is Mumsnet such a really awful place of transphobia? And I guess there's something particularly for parents of oh, well, if I brought my kids up in this really gendered way, and I'm now realizing maybe that wasn't great for them. Again, it's the real oh, I don't want to acknowledge that, so instead I'm gonna put my defense. I'm gonna blame trans people for this rather than blaming the system that I'm part of, and I have to recognize I've been perpetuating. Yeah.
God forbid we reevaluate anything.
Yeah, right. And it is hard as well because we also have this really harsh sort of call out culture where you can't get anything wrong. So I do have a little sympathy for like why people struggle to like go back on things they've said before and done before and be like, I was wrong, because we're not always, again, we kind of shame people a lot of the time when they do that.
Yeah.
Or it's very hard to allow, you know, we have this like kind of idea you have to be this rigid, perfect self who goes through life and is always perfect. So I think the more we can have a sort of culture where we allow people to grow and learn. You know, it's like I want to see J.K. Rowling sit down with trans kids, as I think Mermaids has offered that she do, and like, you know, come back and say, yeah, I've changed my mind. That would be awesome, right?
Yeah, I think what that is something I love so much about your podcast and podcasts in general, but I think you really do it so brilliantly, the two of you in your podcast, that it is this amazing antidote to the internet and the kind of like short opinion, and so much short fire opinions are about gender and sexuality and all these things, and it's such an antidote is just listening a long drawn out conversation.
They're getting longer and longer, mate. It's like we're over an hour like now. So I'm sorry about that if you were looking for a short, snappy you know, hot take, because we very rarely give that these days.
I think that's very needed. I think it's the anti-Twitter, and I think that's
yes, a long listen. I like it.
I've had this. I don't know who. I need to find out who wrote this phrase, but I've had it in my head all week, sort of thinking about these issues, where it's something like, and you just made me think of it in what you were saying, as when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And I keep on thinking about that in terms of what you said of that sort of defensiveness of people being confronted with what actually is equality, but because they haven't felt like that before, it now feels like they're being attacked and they're being oppressed in some way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, yeah, that's where kind of reframing is helpful, because I think it can get quite individualized, this conversation around sort of privilege, and more like a kind of idea of like each individual needs to like, you know, tear themselves apart and look for their shitty prejudices and privileges. And yeah, right. And I just, again, I kind of don't buy that approach as well, because it's still quite a neoliberal capitalist approach of like, let's look at it on the individual level. And if every individual like turns in on themselves and looks for their horribleness, like that doesn't do much to change the world. It is the systems and structures that are the problem. Of course, we embody these systems and structures. We can't help it because we live in this world, but it's those that we want to change, right? So again, that's why I'm like, let's really think again about using shame as a tactic, and let's think about collectivity here. How can we form solidarity across movements? You know, and that is not to kind of erase the specificity of like race works in this way and class works in this way and gender works in this way. But yeah, I definitely think something where it's more about joining up rather than kind of separating into our individual units and doing like yet more scrutiny of ourselves. And also this point again about it doesn't usually serve certainly in these areas, gender, sex and relationships, it doesn't really serve the people who are in the so-called norm at all either. You know, it's not that it's being great for them, you know, it's bad for everybody. And it's like, you know, we need to change it for everybody. We need to get everyone on side of like how bad it is for everyone and change it, rather than that sort of approach of, like that it's a kind of zero-sum game that somebody has to win and someone has to lose. Again, that's a particularly kind of competitive capitalist way of seeing things, which just isn't the way we have to do things, right?
Yeah, and I suppose that would be like trying to fix the system whilst also holding up those it's us against you kind of systems at the same time.
Yeah, and it is really hard because we are trying to change systems while we are within the system. So it's quite complicated work that we have to do. But I think it's good to keep thinking critically about what is the best approach here.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you. So I'm gonna be thinking in these circles for a while now.
Right.
So, what questions do we have for you now? So, do you have any advice, or more for a couple in terms of sex now? Do you have any advice for communications around having sex with a trans partner, maybe as this person?
Yes, I do. So this kind of relates to Justin and my work. Like what you see, I guess, with a lot of sex advice is that it's like, here's the standard sex advice, you know, and it's quite often, if it's a book, it's quite often, you know, here's a bunch of positions that you can have sex in, because that's pretty standard sex advice, and maybe a bit of like how to spice up your love life kind of advice. And then if you're lucky, you might see like there's a box, or there's a couple of pages somewhere about LGBT, maybe T people. I've not seen a mainstream sex advice book that has even the bit on trans. But there's certainly this idea that somehow sex between same-sex couples or sex with a trans person would be different, and it's like you should know some things about having sex with a trans person. Like, I would not adhere to that view, so I'm not going to give you like 5 top tips for having sex with a trans person. What I would say is, like, great sex assumes that the person and the body in front of you every time is going to be different. You know, even actually the same person and body from time to time, you should assume it may not work in the same way that it did last time, right? So it's kind of like the same advice would be for like how to have sex with a disabled person, how to have sex with a trans person. Like, if you do the things that are about that would be generally the blueprint for having really good sex, that would work particularly well for a disabled person, for a trans person, because you'd be assuming like, oh, this body that I'm going to learn now is going to be different to everyone I've ever encountered. You know, what I need to do is be really present to this person and their body, to learn how this person and body work, you know, to be really ongoing in my consent around, you know, what do you like, what do you not like, you know, finding it out. It's like this curiosity between us, you know. So in a sense, if we're talking about sex between a cis person and a trans person, same in both directions, you know. That if that trans person is kind of going back to the cis person and assuming that they're just going to work in this kind of standard cookie cut away because they're cis, you know, they're going to be wrong, because every, you know, anatomy works differently, every genitals work differently. Yeah, like, it's just going to be different for each person. So it's like, so much sex advice just assumes this like standard of, I guess, penis and vagina intercourse is what is equal sex. The goal of sex is like an orgasm, you know, there's this sexual script. That's what we need to throw out, you know, and like that's for everybody, rather than just like, oh, it's a special thing if you're having sex with someone of the same sex, or if you're having sex with a trans person or a disabled person.
Yeah, absolutely. For everyone, it just comes down to communication, doesn't it? Being present and communicate.
Yeah, being really present, being up for being playful and curious. Yeah, like being up for getting to know that particular body and that particular set of desires that person has. But it is, you know, it is really challenging, unfortunately, because there's still this idea of this default script, you know, that we kind of should follow, and that doing anything different is this special case, rather than us being able to, like, you know, just get rid of the script and think like, what would we like to do right now? With anything being okay as well. Again, it's like getting away from the idea that success equals an orgasm, getting away from the idea that you even need to have sex, you know, starting to question, well, what is sex and what isn't sex anyway? Yeah.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. And how do you think the world of sex education, although I feel like we're talking about things more in sex education and we're being more diverse in our language, how do you think sex educators can do better and be more inclusive towards trans people and trans bodies?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose partly it's about language, and again, there can be this default to like, oh, we'll talk about men, assuming that men have particular anatomy and particular experiences, and we'll talk about women, assuming the same. And, you know, we might give a token mention to non-binary people, we might not deal with that at all. Or some sex educators will even talk about men, women, and trans people, which is that's really problematic, because it's suggesting that trans men and trans women are not men and women. So yeah, people make moves to, like, for example, talk about, you know, bodies with penises or bodies with vulvas, rather than using that language of, you know, men assuming men have penises and women assuming women have vulvas. And again, that's important for cis people as well, because, you know, not all cis people are going to have a certain anatomy, and certainly, you know, we just can't assume anything about a person's genitals, like, because of their gender identity. But again, with that, I'm always a bit like, I want to go a stage further, you know, because again, this sort of real focus on genitals, it still kind of brings us back to that idea that the best thing people can be doing is rubbing their genitals against each other. There's like lots of other things that we could be doing. Like, you know, why are we focused on that part of the body? Why are we focused on that as sex? You know, it's like, there's a lot of some other things we can do. And also like this idea that, you know, even the genitals, it's like a spectrum. You know, it's not as simple as this, you know, penises here. It's not, that's not a binary as well, you know. So intersex people, trans people, lots of people, and it's all made of the same stuff initially, right? So, you know, there might be some things that some penis owners and some clitoris owners like have in common that two different penis owners wouldn't have in common, if you get the point.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, thinking about it more as a spectrum, getting that sense of the diversity within, you know, even if you were having a binary perspective, there's a massive diversity in how penises work and a massively diversity in how vaginas and clitorises work and how anuses work. And then, yeah, maybe like really questioning whether that genital focus is even what we want to be, the line we want to be going down, because there's so much else people can be doing.
Absolutely. I've never really thought about it that specifically, that it is just a complete obsession with genitals,
right
it?
Yeah
We're a society that refuses to talk about sex, being obsessed with genitals.
Because, you know, so much, you know, it's just a cliche that so much is in the mind, right? But yeah, like there's just so little of sex advice or sex education that's really about fantasy and desire and people really tuning into what lights them up. There's very little on any other parts of the body, you know, even though we know all kinds of the body can enjoy all kinds of different sensations. So, you know, it's just like lifting that focus on genitals, I think, getting a bit less obsessed with genitals in general.
I think that is great advice. How does taking hormones, if someone has decided to take hormones, how does that affect sort of libido and sexuality, or how can it? So, again, no binary thing that happens.
So there's a word that you might know that Justin and I like a lot, which is biopsychosocial. It's like one of the few long words I will use, you know, like because I think that's an important one when it comes to hormones. Like we just couldn't tell, like if somebody goes on testosterone, for example, it would be really hard to know, like if their libido goes up, as sometimes happens, like is that due to the hormone itself, which can have that effect? Is it due to their expectations, like that's what they thought it was going to do? Is it due to the fact they're now a lot more comfortable in their body? Is it due to the fact they're being read accurately, so they're getting a lot less stress, you know, out on the streets, so they're not getting misgendered all the time? There's so many different reasons why they could be going up. So, and it probably is a combination of those. So yeah, again, it would be like, so many people take hormones or do things that affect their levels of hormones over their life. So again, this would be the area where I'd be like challenging that trans-cis split as well. It's like we can think about birth control, we can think about hormone replacement therapy, we can think about the effect of some cancer treatments on the levels of circulating hormones in the body. And also like scientists like Sari Van Anders are now saying that the things we do, like our behaviors, affect our levels of hormones like testosterone more than our hormones affect our behaviors. So like, right? So doing like certain sports or being more competitive will actually affect your levels of testosterone in your body. Yeah.
Wow.
Wild, isn't it? So there's this kind of sense of like all of us all the time, our levels of those kind of things that are seen as the sex hormones are going up and down, and due to all kinds of external factors and internal factors. So again, maybe the focus isn't just on trans people there. And maybe that explains some of the, you know, sexual fluidity as well, of like, you know, people's sexualities change so much over their lifetime, and it's totally fine to have, you know, times when you've got no sex drive, times when it's really high, you know, for it to stay in the same place, for it to change over time, for your, you know, attraction. Like some trans people, their attraction really changes, like what gender they're attracted to, for example. Menopause too, yes, absolutely, menopause too, thank you. Yeah. So, you know, sexuality can change radically, or it can stay the same, or anything in between. And hormones is one of the things that influences, but also loads of other things about our lives influence that.
Wow, that's amazing. That sort of, again, completely flips. Oh, someone has said they've lost audio.
Yeah, I saw that.
Is that okay? Give us a thumbs up if people can hear us. I hope that we haven't lost audio for everyone. I don't think we have.
Well, Rachel heard me miss off a menopause, which I should have mentioned. So hopefully that means that at least one person is hearing.
We've got one person listening. That's
Yeah.
okay. We've got some that. Okay, good. So with so the government, the trans rights at the moment are getting a real hammering, and there's a lot of horrible rhetoric, and there's also the Rowling stuff that happened. It is not a fun time to be a trans or non-binary person. And again, we've sort of maybe covered this in like little bits, but how can we be the best allies at the moment? How can we support the trans community in the best way without, I don't know, overstepping, without explaining how to be doing it or anything like that? But yeah, being the best allies we can be.
Explaining, is that a thing? I bet it is. Yeah, I mean, we so need it, you know, that's for sure. I think at the moment that pressure on the government is a really important one. So writing to MP and putting pressure directly on Downing Street around not rolling back trans protections. You know, so the Gender Recognition Act consultation that they had, you know, it came out that people did want a change to the Gender Recognition Act to make it easier for trans people to self-define their gender, just a little bit easier, just a little bit simpler, just a little bit cheaper. And you know, that was the advice, was that the government were going to change it. They're now saying they're probably not going to, or that was the leaked document anyway, but also that they may roll back some of the help for young, you know, this current sort of trans healthcare for young people. And there's stuff about single sex spaces, which trans people have always been able to access previously in their gender, and there's some kind of suggestion that might be rolling back a bit like the US bathroom bills, which would be a terrible step back. So yeah, pressure on the government, you know, to go with the consultation and to make the changes they said they were going to make, and certainly not to roll back protections for trans people. Support for particularly charities around young people. You know, I just think, what is it like to be a gender diverse young person right now, like to see all of that, but also J.K. Rowling, that's a particularly hard one, because I just think a lot of young queer and trans people see themselves in those books. You know, there's this kind of idea of, you know, if you're different, actually you might be special, you might be magical, you might be able to go to Hogwarts, you know, and also, you know, that kind of idea of being half-bloods, and that, you know, like that shouldn't be discriminated against. You know, I think that kind of relates. People have seen non-binary in that, or bisexuality in that. You know, it's just really hard to have had somebody that's, you know, made this beloved kind of thing that so many young people have grown up with, then hearing that person profess anti-trans views. So yeah, supporting Gendered Intelligence or Mermaids, which are two really excellent charities for trans people. Also pressure on the media. You know, the British media have been absolutely, words fail me as to how terrible they've been. You know, the problem, you know, the Gender Recognition Act change, it's not even something that's at the top of the agenda for a lot of trans people. You know, it would make things a little bit easier for people, but it wasn't, you know, like homelessness, healthcare, all these other areas are kind of a lot more important for a lot of trans people, prisons as well. So what we've had is, since 2017, when they did that consultation, is this utter moral panic, where the British press and media have been putting out, you know, like often several articles even in the same day of various kinds of transphobic mythology. You know, and yeah, there's a real sense of a kind of cultural gaslighting when you think that trans people are some of the most vulnerable in terms of rates of suicide and discrimination and hate crime and domestic abuse, and yet are being painted as perpetrators of violence rather than victims of violence. You know, it's just really horrific. So I think pressure on media as well, like if people can be, calling out the BBC, you know, every single newspaper, there really isn't one that's doing a good job on this, sadly, you know, saying it's just simply not okay and they won't have it, and, you know, deciding not to support those organizations unless they get a whole lot better. You know, they constantly kind of put it across as like, oh, we're trying for balance here, so we'll get a trans perspective and an anti-trans perspective, but it's not balanced to have one person who's saying, you know, I exist and I should have some rights, and another person that says you don't exist and you should have no rights. Like, that's not a balanced debate. Like, just think about applying that to any other area and you can see just how deeply problematic that is. So
Yeah.
media need to up their game, put pressure on them.
Absolutely. What do you think is a good way for doing that with media? You say sort of like effectively boycotting all of those publications, but is it writing to them? Is
Yeah,
there
I
maybe
would
this
say, I mean, writing to them, boycotting the publications. There's some good organisations like Transmedia Watch and All About Trans, who, you know, engage particularly around media. So they might be good to ask that question. But as with all these areas, I think it's also really important that everybody, like, there could be a real urgency, right, with these moments, like Me Too, Black Lives Matter recently. Well, obviously the various times that Black Lives Matter has become a really like pivotal point of protest, and then the various points at which the trans moral panic has kind of become really something that people are talking about. But there's sort of that idea that it's a marathon, not a sprint, is important. Like, it's not about, especially if you're not someone directly affected, like doing this kind of urgent, I've got to do all the things right now, and kind of like doing this performative activism. That's also not kind of what's the most helpful thing. It's taking a pause and really thinking that what's my skill set here? What do I have to offer? You know, what things could I do with learning a bit more about before I engage with them? Taking it slowly, because if we kind of get too like doing everything really quickly, we can often just burn out, and it just becomes like that's the thing of that week and then it's gone, which is not what anybody wants. So it's like, what's that slow, steady kind of approach we can take here, as well, like thinking about what can you do ongoing in this area.
Yeah, not just when it's trending.
Not just when it's trending, yeah, exactly, because it's not going anywhere, it seems.
Absolutely. I have realised I have kept you for far too long.
I couldn't remember how long we were meant to be on, right? I think you asked these
Are you
questions.
happy to stay for a little bit more?
Yeah,
Have you got time? You sure?
Yeah, if you want to.
We're coming up for around an hour, and I don't want to take up too much of your evening. But could you recommend some good resources for trans people, or for people who are on the journey thinking about their gender identity, or non-binary people? What are some good resources that you would send someone?
Yes. I'm just going to get up my document that I did earlier to remind myself what I was recommending there. So yeah, for young people particularly, Gendered Intelligence and Mermaids are really good. For the stuff that I've done, How to Understand Your Gender, the book that Alex Ian Taffy and I wrote, was really like a sort of first port of call for anyone. But again, I would say not just trans and non-binary people, but also, you know, it's really important that cis people understand their gender, and binary people understand their gender too. So that's a kind of self-help, like how to explore gender. Whereas Gender, a Graphic Guide, is like a comic introduction to how gender works. So if you do better with comics rather than written books, that might be a good one. Or if you're more like, what's this whole area of gender and how does it work? And then, like, the one great thing to come out, it's a bit like the pandemic, you know, it's awful, but it has revealed some systems and structures that need to change. Like, there has been some good stuff come out of the pandemic, and trans moral panic is a bit similar. It's like generally horrendous, but what we do have in the UK, having been through this, is like so many amazing trans people, sort of creatives, authors, etc. So there's just so many people you could usefully follow, and learn from in terms of books and social media. So just to mention a few, I would say C.N. Lester, Juno Roche, Kachenga, Saba Chowdhury, Travis Alabanza, Ivy DeLuca. Find the people who speak to you, but there's just so many like really amazing books and kind of art and music and such like out there that you can follow.
Thank you so much. That is excellent. And we will try and, if you're happy to send me through that list as well, I'll try and...
I'll send you the post so you can put any of it up. Yeah.
Amazing. That we absolutely do that. And that, I won't keep you any longer. I won't keep you any longer. Thank you so much for chatting with me this evening. It's been so fascinating, and so interesting to get all of your wisdom. Is there anything you want to tell people about, tell people where it is? I think we've covered a lot of things, but is there anything you want to plug whilst you're here?
Thank you. I guess, well, a nice thing, the most recent thing that I've had come out is an edited collection called Non-Binary Lives. So if you're interested in hearing from a diverse range of non-binary people, and it's all about the kind of intersections with other aspects of experience, so like class and race and disability. Non-binary lives, which was edited by myself and Cap Gupta, Ben Vincent, and Joss Twist was the main editor on that. So that'd be a great book to get, and people are really enjoying it so far, I think.
Amazing. Oh, that sounds incredible. Sorry, did you say where to get hold of that?
It's Jessica Kingsley is the publisher, so I think you can get it direct from them, or, you know, support your independent bookshop. Gaze the Word would be a really good one to order it from, for example.
So that was Non-Binary Lives, and check out the podcast as well. I'm such a big fan.
Please do.
It was wonderful. Okay, thank you so much for chatting, and I hope that I get to meet you soon in the real world.
In flesh, that would be great. Yes.
Thank you so much for chatting with us.
No worries. Thanks, so.